Just to welcome you all, this is our 5th seminar in the Blended Learning Seminar series that QQI started in 2020. So, as you might see from our backgrounds here in our holding slide, this is our 10th anniversary year, so we're delighted to continue the series and to work in partnership with colleagues and learners across further education, training and higher education. I'll have to take this opportunity for a shameless plug and say that we have a big anniversary conference in Croke Park in October, and I'll paste a little link into the chat later on. But today's seminar, we're going to focus on UDL, so Universal Design for Learning for HE and FET in a blended learning context. So to talk about this morning, we're delighted to welcome Dara Ryder, and Dara is the CEO of AHEAD. His colleague Tommy Crampton is Education Manager at AHEAD, and Tommy's here as well this morning. We also have Helena Farrell, who's from Kinsale College, and she's the Learning Support and Disability Coordinator there. And finally, we have Dr. Lisa Padden, who's a Programme Manager at the Immersive Reader at UCD. So as I mentioned, we're recording the seminar this morning. We'll add that recording to our website, and our presenters have kindly agreed to share the slides afterwards as well. We have Michelle from PCR Captioning here this morning, I think, to provide captions. We've turned off cameras and microphones for the presentation, but please feel free to use the chat for comments or questions or reactions, and we can discuss those when the presenters finish. We can turn on your camera and your microphone then if anyone wants to raise a hand to ask a question, and we can enable that for you if you want to kind of be on the camera and speak more directly to the presenters. So thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. We hope you enjoyed the seminar, and I'll hand over to Dara now to start off. Thanks, Dara.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Laura, and thanks to you all for joining us. It's great to see so many here coming up towards the lunchtime hour. So listen, thanks a million for giving us lending us your ears today. So yeah, feel free to interrupt us as we go. And when I'm kind of speaking, Lisa, maybe you'll monitor the chat and see if there's any hands up. We're absolutely interruptible, so feel free to get involved in the session, and feel free to use the chat as much as you like for you can slag us off, or you can pop in links, or you can do whatever you want in the chat. We'd love to see all that happen. So I suppose the session today, basically what we're going to do is we're going to first of all look at sort of why UDL, why we should be looking at UDL, especially in the quality context, because this is a QQI webinar. We're going to look a little bit of the origins of UDL, so we're going to step back a little bit in time and start to look at universal design first and introduce that as the broader concept. Then I'm going to hand over to Lisa. She's going to talk a little bit about the transition from UD to UDL and how we apply universal design in the teaching and learning context, and specifically through using the UDL framework. We're then going to start to explore a little bit what that actually looks like in practice. And so we'll be giving you some examples. So Lisa will give you some, but then we'll also take a trip over to Kinsale to the wonderful Helena Farrell, who's going to talk a little bit about her own experience as a practitioner. And then we'll come back around at the end, and my colleague Tommy is going to share some resources at the very end of the session to help you explore your UDL journey a little bit further. So I might, just before we get started, what I'd really like to ask you, I suppose, to input into the chat here, and we might have a little chat about it in a minute or two, is what do you know about UDL right now in one sentence? So if you can just have a little think about that as I'm kind of nattering on here, and start to pop it into the chat. Lisa, I might bring you in for a little bit of a conversation about what people in the room are saying about that. So what do you know about UDL in one sentence, please? That would be fantastic. And by the way, feel free to say absolutely nothing. That's a good place to be if you're coming to a webinar like this as we introduce these concepts. So I'm going to just share my slides. Is that okay? Everyone can see that? See that well enough? Brilliant.
Yeah, we can see that there.
Brilliant. So
Geraldine has shared there UDL as a framework to support all learners regardless of background.
That's very good. That's pretty on point. On point.
Anna has done the UDL course with AHEAD, so that's brilliant. So you've done our digital badge. Maria said enhancing and improving accessibility for all. I think that's a great way to put it. Lisa saying content that supports the different ways people learn. So I think what comes across, everybody's understanding that this is something for all students, for every student in education, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely, and I can see the word choice coming up as a theme in several of these comments, which again is central to the whole UDL message. Options, choice, flexibility, all of those things are central. So I think we're in a good place in that people have some understanding, and a good few are coming in from the UDL course, so they'll probably be able to give this webinar themselves. So hopefully we'll be able to provide an extra piece of learning for you and give you a chance to reflect on especially in the blended context. So looking at why UDL, okay, why do we think about UDL? Why should we consider it as something that should be central to part of our practice as teachers, as educators? Well, first of all, UDL is very evidence-based. So Lisa will talk a little bit later on, but UDL has 3 guidelines, or 3 principles, should I say, 9 guidelines and 31 checkpoints. And all of those checkpoints are individually evidenced quite heavily. If you have a chance to explore the actual UDL guidelines themselves and the interactive website that hosts the guidelines now, each of those individual checkpoints lists a huge resource of references that underpins each one. So it's heavily evidence-based as a framework. And that, I suppose, gives us trust as educators that what we're doing is with quality. You know, so the application of UDL, often people think about things as choice. Well, when I start to offer choice, how am I sure those choices are equitable? Is it fair? Well, actually, the evidence supports that a UDL approach actually supports quality rather than questions quality, if you like. The second piece is that it's internationally recognized, so it's used all over the world, and it's used in educational settings of all types, so right from primary school to secondary level into tertiary settings. And that's really because it's principle based and action based, so it's non-prescriptive, and it allows the educator to interpret the checkpoints and the guidelines and the principles for their own context. So that's another really useful piece. In terms of policy, it's very aligned with both our international commitments and our national policies, and I'll talk a little bit about that more specifically in a few minutes. And also, I mentioned the non-prescriptive piece already. So I think that's actually a key part to UDL implementation, is that it's not asking people to do X, Y, and Z specifically. What it's asking people to do as educators is engage in reflective practice to understand what these evidence-based checkpoints mean for your context, for your learners. So you're very much shaping it with your own expertise at the forefront. You know, it really involves your critical engagement as an educator in order to successfully implement UDL. Other reasons we should look at it, well, it's a response to increasing diversity. So the statistics on engagement in further and higher education show us that our learner populations are becoming more diverse. And I suppose I mentioned the word diversity here, but actually from a UDL perspective, we'd like to think about it as variability, because we like to think about variability as a norm in the population, rather than thinking about diversity, which we can sometimes bring us into a place of only thinking about those sort of priority cohorts, as they're called often in our national policies. But really, UDL is a response to the fact that everyone learns differently, and by building in more flexibility and choice, we give learners more agency and more option to internalize learning and to demonstrate what they know. The research supports that UDL implementation increases student engagement and increases student satisfaction. So the research that's out there tells us that that is true. It supports greater accessibility to learning, greater flexibility for learners. So increasingly, as we become to a kind of hybrid world where, as well, where students have so many demands on them, they might be learners who are engaging in part-time or even sometimes full-time work on the side. They may be parents. They may have all sorts of other life demands that you can't imagine. So UDL helps us to support greater flexibility in learning as well. It also helps us to encourage greater student voice. So a lot of the UDL approach is really about seeing students as collaborators and ensuring that they have real opportunity to input into the pathway that their learning takes, and to make learning choices that I suppose that support their own engagement in the learning process. And I mentioned choice is key to UDL. That's actually central to all of the principles of UDL. And one thing that's often sort of missed with UDL is that actually that the overarching goal of the framework is to create expert learners, what CAST calls expert learners. And really, so what we're looking at here is not just about offering more ways for them to engage with learning, but it's actually about building a mastery of learning itself. So by doing that, what we do is we build skills and develop skills in our learners that they can apply in different contexts right through their lifespans, about how to self-regulate, how to set goals and reach them, all of those kind of lovely things that we think about when we talk about executive function, which we probably won't get into in too much detail today, but is a very important part of the framework and what underpins it. So just looking from a policy landscape of universal design for learning, and just to give you, I suppose, my reflections on how it aligns with international and national policy. So I suppose from an international perspective, it aligns very well with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we all know we are hearing everywhere about in our work, and we're very committed to as further and higher education sectors, embedding those goals within our work. So you can see here a quote here that we have to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong opportunities for all. And the UDL framework very much aligns with that. Within the UN CRPD, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which Ireland is also a signatory of, we can see it specifically calls out universal design in UDL. Actually, this quote here is from a National Disability Authority policy paper. So the National Disability Authority is an Irish state body that's dedicated to looking at the rights of people with disabilities in how government bodies go about their business, and also looking specifically at universal design. So you can see that they've, in their view, that universal design, UDL and inclusion are key to achieving the right to education and training as enshrined within the convention. So we can see that it's quite specifically aligned there. It gets even much more specific when we come down to the actual national policies regarding FET and higher education. So you can see in the most recent FET strategy that there's that actual specific commitment there to developing inclusive practice across the system, adopting a universal design for learning approach and shaping its future precision. So this is a very explicit goal of FET. And equally in our National Access Plan, now we're currently just in the revision stage of the National Access Plan, so we're expecting the updated plan or the new plan to arrive very shortly. But the plan to 2021, which is the existing plan we're still kind of working off, specifically calls out UDL. So it says equity of access policies should be mainstreamed into the everyday life of higher education institutions, and that this should be done in accordance with the principles of universal design for learning. So you can see that there's a very specific alignment there, and actually we're expecting that in the revised plan that we'll actually have a strengthened commitment to UDL, and it's going to feature in more areas of the plan, and it's going to feature as part of some of the have a specific objectives, but it'll also feature as part of some of the KPIs for other objectives in the plan. So we see an increased commitment to universal design. So I just thought it'd be worth taking a wee step back about having a little bit of a reflection. Most of you as educators in the room will be familiar with the concept of differentiation as a way in which we support diverse learners. In particular, that comes from maybe the zone of supporting learners with disabilities as a specific connotation there. And people might be asking, what is the difference? This is how, as educators, we would have supported students with disabilities. So we would understand that a learner has a barrier. We explore the barrier with the learner. We make a very specific adjustment to the curriculum or to the teaching approach to ensure that learner can gain access to the curriculum or gain equal access to learning, as we say. I would kind of see this approach as what we would call putting up ladders. So it's reactive. It's all about the student comes in front of me, I see what's happening right then, I react and I make a decision based on what's in front of me right then. So if you like, what we have is we have one mode of learning going through and we're reacting individually to these students. And in some senses, what happens is when the next diverse learner comes through the door, we have to stop and do that all again. So we make that change one time for one learner, and then we do it again when the next diverse learner comes through the door. That's the differentiation approach. And although there's nothing wrong with that approach, in fact, it may still be relevant in a UDL context that sometimes you will have to differentiate that, the UDL approach hasn't covered absolutely all angles, because it never can. So you still might have to do that. But instead, what the UDL approach encourages us to do is to think proactively. So it's about proactively anticipating the broad diversity of learners that may be in our classroom and building options and choices into the delivery so that you cover most of the learning needs within through a planned approach. So before those learners ever come into the classroom, you're building in more flexibility, more choice, more accessibility into the fabric of the design and delivery, so that the learners actually don't even have to put up their hand to say, actually, I need something different. Most learners will be able to actually engage in the learning process with equal agency at the point of delivery. So that's really the difference between those two things. And I think about UDL then as smashing down those walls. So rather than continuously putting up ladders for the learners to get over what is a barrier that actually exists in the curriculum, what we're instead doing is smashing down the walls and making the curriculum itself more flexible. So it changes our focus as educators. So before we get into UDL itself, just thought it'd be worth introducing the broader concept of universal design, which is, I suppose, the origin of UDL really. So universal design is a broader approach that's really focused originally in the zones of architecture and product design, and it was developed by an architect called Ron Mace, who was actually disabled himself in the 1970s. And the definition here that's taken from the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is that universal design means the design of products, environments, programs and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So if we think about the example that we just gave there, that adaptation or specialized design was the differentiation. That's what we're talking about in a learning context. So what universal design is about is recognizing that nobody is average. So that if we actually design for average, if we design one track for average, we're actually designing for nobody. Whereas if we try to design to the edges of our user base, to the margins of our user base, and build in that flexibility, then actually we end up with products, services, buildings that are much more usable by all people. And there's actually really good examples of universal design that you will encounter every day within your life. So I've put some examples up here on screen. So in the first image, there's a woman walking through some automatic doors. Now we think about automatic doors, they're just something, they're there, right? We walk through them, we all use them. But you know, these were actually originally designed for people with disabilities, but we see that everyone gains the benefits. So you have people, parents in the room using buggies will know the value of automatic doors as they're out shopping. That you'll have the delivery man who's coming with a full box of goods to deliver. You'll have maybe someone who's elderly who's maybe losing the strength to push a heavy door. So all of these things are all of these people are equally encountered in. I can see Anna's put in a lovely graphic that talks about the difference between equality and equity, and you have to click on that to see the final piece as well. The second piece here is the adjustable seatbelt. Again, if we think about it, the adjustable seatbelt allows people to customize their own experience of driving a car, so that they're not looking out over the wheel like this, or that they're not, their hands aren't so far away from the car. So we can adjust the seat up. We can adjust sometimes the wheel even. So these things are adjustable products that try to bend to the user rather than the user bending to them. It's probably a good way to put it. So I suppose, before we go into UD, I might hand over to Lisa, but we're going after this to talk about how universal design concepts translate more specifically into the teaching and learning concept, because UDL is a much more niche focused on that. But I might hand over to you, Lisa. I know this is a reflection you'd like to do.
Great, thanks a million, Dara. So just to get us all thinking about universal design, and in the context that Dara's talked about, so universal design in that the space that we're in, the products that we use in that broad sense. So if we look at the space that you're in, so if I look at the office that I'm in here, what aspects of it are universally designed? So how can everybody get into the room that you're in, into the space that you're in? If they do get into that space, can they then use the space in the way that it's intended without any adaptation? And you can just pop into the chat anything that you notice. So right from the entrance, how can they get in? Can they get in easily? Can they use everything that's there? Can they sit at the desk? Can they use the equipment that you have there? So in the office that I'm in at the moment, there is no automatic door, so they wouldn't necessarily be able to get in the door if there was any challenges. So yes, you will get access to the slides after the presentation. So that's an issue. That's a barrier that's there. If somebody did come into the room, is there enough space for anybody to move around? So if you were in a wheelchair, for example, could you actually move around the space? And I think no, actually, is the answer to the office that I'm in at the moment. We have a lot of material and furniture, so, not ideal. So, and then when they actually come to use the equipment. So if we think about that, so you've had to think about your physical space that you're in. So think as well about the educational environment that you work in. So can every potential student access the education that you're offering? So can they get into your course? Once they're in the course, can they then engage in that education equitably with everybody around them? So all of their peers. So attending classes, engaging in the material that's presented at the class, the assessment types, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about universal design for learning. So it's taking that idea of equity of access beyond the physical realm and beyond the idea of somebody just being able to get in, and actually talking about the experience that they have and the equitable nature of that experience. So we might just move to the next slide, Dara. So universal design as it translates to universal design for learning. Universal design for learning was developed by CAST, based in Harvard, and CAST, they worked a lot in the area of neuroscience, the teaching and learning sciences. As Dara said earlier, every single principle of universal design for learning really is based in the sciences and is evidence-based. So every one of those 31 checkpoints is evidence-based. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to go and have a look at those UDL guidelines after the session today, and you'll find an absolute wealth of information to get you started. So it's the three core principles of universal design for learning relate to the why of learning, so how we engage and providing multiple means of engagement or multiple options for students to engage. The what of learning, so your actual content, and that's through your multiple means of representation. And then the how of learning, so that's what the student actually does in your educational environment. How do they express that they've met the learning outcomes? And you provide multiple options for action and expression. So it's all based on neuroscience and kind of mapping of how we learn. And ultimately, the options that you provide, the choice that you provide, means that everybody can engage equitably in an educational environment. And we aren't going down that traditional educational route where we try to fit the student to the education. Instead, we're actually making sure that the education fits all of our students. And it's not the traditional kind of didactic approach where you're an active teacher and your student is passive. So we'll just move on to the next slide there. So we'd encourage you to start small. And what we're going to talk about today are a lot of plus ones. So anybody who's done the UDL badge will be very familiar with us talking about the plus one approach. So this is based on the work of Thomas Tobin, who's a UDL advocate, UDL consultant in the States, and has done lots of work and did a lot of work with the team at AHEAD and the FET sector in terms of the FET UDL guidelines. So his approach, and it's one that we've definitely embraced, is to think about a plus one. So UDL is a mindset. It's a framework that you can use. It isn't a list of instructions. And you have to think all the time, well, what's one thing that I can do now to make this, whether it's a class, an assessment, an individual activity, to make this a universal design approach. So we'd encourage you to think as we go through today what your plus one is going to be after we finish this session. And we're going to go through the three principles and some plus ones related to all three of those principles.
What's great, what I love about this approach is plus one approaches. I mean, there's literally countless ways you can actually apply the UDL principles because it is non-prescriptive. As I said, it does take you to reflect and see what is my understanding of this checkpoint for my learners, from my context, from my field is another important factor. But what the plus one approach does is it allows you to do that and just add one more way within the context of the principles, one more way for students to engage, one more way that we represent content, one more way that students can demonstrate what they know. And I suppose those things can be also quite small sometimes. You know, there can be things that you might be able to produce in 20 minutes, whereas another plus one might be, you might make a much bigger commitment to if you have a specific thing. Maybe it's the creation of a video or something that might take you 2 hours or 3 hours, or could take you 1 week if it's a really, really big plus one. But you know, there's a lot of flexibility in how people go. So start small is really good advice here. Start small and make one change at a time.
So the first principle we're going to talk about then is providing multiple options for engagement. So this is the why of learning. This is how we get our students engaged, we get them motivated, we get them interested in their learning journey. So making sure that they have those clear learning outcomes, they know exactly what the objectives are, and that you discuss those with the students. I think sometimes learning outcomes can kind of sit as this static piece for a particular module or particular course. But really they should be discussed with students. They should be meaningful for students. A student should be able to use that in terms of being able to reflect on their learning and go, why am I doing this course? Okay, here are my learning outcomes. They should make sense. They should be in plain English. They should be really, really clear. And there should be checkpoints then throughout the student's journey where they can see where those learning outcomes are embedded in the course and in their journey. Really, this is about providing options for students as well to reflect. And Dara talked really well earlier about the development of expert learners, and providing options and providing choice and allowing students and encouraging students to reflect on their journey as a learner really does help them to stay motivated in their education. So again, the education isn't something that's happening to a student. It's something that's engaging the student, that they're very active in, that they have choices, they have options as they go through, and they see themselves very much as an active agent in that particular journey. And the goal here is to develop those purposeful and motivated students who'll be able to sustain motivation. And we know how difficult that can be as we go through a semester, and particularly over the past couple of years, I think that's been quite challenging. But to maintain motivation all the way through to completion of a particular modular course.
Absolutely, I love that you said the way you said that, Lisa, about that's not something that's happening to them. It's a great phrase. And Helena, actually yourself, I've seen in one of a previous contribution that she did, Helena had said, I remember one of the big things that she took from it was, this is not my class, it's yours, you know. And I think that's a really powerful statement to kind of hand that sort of ownership over. Sorry, Lisa, interrupted you there.
No worries at all. So some of the +1 examples then, how can you motivate your learners, keep them engaged? Well, one thing that can be quite useful is to have online checklists for students. So at the end of week 1, what should I have done? What should I have completed? What should I know now? And that's helping them again to reflect, to keep track of their learning. It encourages them to think about the development process and to think as well actively about the learning outcomes. And I had some really interesting comments there in the chat. So learning outcomes has to be meaningful and accessible to learners. That's how they understand why they're actually doing a particular course. So something really simple like those regular checklists so students can stay on track. It also helps you as an educator to think and reflect on, well, what should students know at the end of week 1, week 2? At what point will they have met this learning outcome? Or, you know, how will I measure that? How can a student know that they've, you know, gotten to this point in their learning journey? So that can be useful. And as a +1, I mean, obviously you can do it for the whole course, for the whole program. As a +1, think about, so halfway through the module, what should a student know? What should they have done? What should they have completed? And just sit down, take 20 minutes, as Dara said, and think about what the student should have done halfway through. And, you know, workshop that with students as well, even go through with them and see, you know, how far along are you in your learning journey? And can be really active in that reflection process as well. So something else that can help is kind of polling around the course direction or content. So students are partners. So actually engaging students and not going in with everything set absolutely in concrete from the beginning, but engaging with the learners in the classroom, talking to them about what they want to learn, what they hope to achieve. What are their objectives for this particular course? And then, you know, working with them on that, letting them see evidence of the fact that you've listened and you've incorporated the feedback that they've given you in terms of what they would like to do and what direction they want to take. Have some choice in the learning activities that students have. So if you're thinking about an individual class where you have one activity that students do, think about how you can build choice into that. So can it be done as group work, as pairs? Can somebody do it individually? Something as simple as that. But looking at the type of activity that students are doing, maybe the instructions that you're giving around it, and, you know, how you can facilitate some choice. So agency and how students engage, whether they're remote or in person. And again, that's something that's come up quite a lot for us in UCD since September. And certainly we're seeing a lot of students who prefer to engage in some instances online. And to have that option, and lots of the modules are offering that option, which is really good. So having trust in students to be able to engage and to make that choice, I think is really important. And we've seen really positive outcomes from being able to have that flexibility there for students. And where there isn't flexibility, we're seeing barriers building up for students. So where there's an insistence on, you know, one particular mode of learning, as opposed to having that flexibility. And we've seen lots of feedback from learners who are really saying they need that flexibility, they want that flexibility. And I think we have to trust students as partners in their learning and as active agents in their learning, as we said already. So having clear objectives, so, you know, choice in how you're going to reach out to students. So one of our colleagues, Trevor, was suggested the friendly weekly email or a reflective discussion. So linking the objectives to the content. So again, always thinking about how the student can reflect on themselves as a learner, how they're engaged, giving them some choice, and linking it back to their own understanding of what they're learning in the program as well. So the clear objectives linking to your learning outcomes. And something that really helps to engage students is collaboration. So an opportunity to work with the other students in their course, to work in a peer group, to have a buddy system, to have kind of a coaching system, whatever it might be, to build that sense of community. And I think that we've always known that that's a great way to engage students. But when we went remote in 2020, it became even clearer how important that sense of community was for students and how important it is to keep them linked in and engaged in their program. Even ourselves in the digital badge, the peer group model works really well. So that's where a group of peers will work together throughout the online course. And it's just providing another, I suppose, method of engagement and making sure that people feel as though they're part of the learning community. And again, that they're not just a passenger, but actually they're driving it along with their peers. And we know students learn so much from each other and often learn more from each other than they do from us. So it's really important that that's built in. And thinking about a +1 approach might be, so a class where you don't have any group work, how can you introduce some group work there? Is it just a 5-minute, pair and share, 2 students work together on a topic, feedback, just getting them linked in, and particularly providing opportunities for students at the start of their program to make those social connections. It's really, really important.
I think what's really interesting about the research behind this is that the act of giving choice in and of itself builds engagement. People understand immediately that it's a different dynamic when you give choice, because the dynamic, the power, if you like, the power systems that underpin what we do in a classroom change dramatically once you start to invite students to be part of the process. So I think that's very interesting. I mean, that makes perfect sense, right? In terms of, we all have been to a conference and we go to lunch and there's literally a tray of ham sandwiches on the table in front of you and everyone's disappointed, nobody's motivated for this lunch. Whereas if you go in and there's a buffet of different things, you can get your own meal. You want this salad on the side, you want this dessert. Suddenly I'm going into lunch with a jump on my step, and it's a different kettle of fish, right? So I think those concepts come across really well in UDL. And I just wanted to throw a few quotes in. These quotes aren't specifically about UDL, I should say, but they're from AHEAD's Learning from Home research. And I thought, given that we're talking about blended concepts and things like that, and as we move back into to in-person, how that's all working out, just some kind of quotes from that which really struck me. And I'm going to kind of marry these up a little bit with the principles and show that, I suppose, the students, and this is specifically students with disabilities for this particular research, but I think it equally applies to the broader student base, really want choice and desire choice and need it if we're going to reach and teach everybody. So this first quote is saying there should be an option for both people who wish to stay at home or go on campus, especially with commuting or classes that can be done online. So you can see here people's taking the commute as a big issue. That's actually really disadvantages some learners who have a very long commute. Disadvantages them in a whole range of ways. They might not be able to access the same level of work, for example, as another student beside them, because the time they have to commute. They may, if the course and the course materials haven't allowed them to do it sitting on their bus, they may lose a lot of learning time while they're sitting on that bus if they haven't got an option to engage with materials while they're on that commute. So those kind of things disadvantage our learners if we don't provide some of those options. And I see another one here. Well, I would like to be able to interact with my peers. My illness causes chronic fatigue and weakness, and I need a lot of extra rest as well as having to attend a lot of medical appointments. So the blended learning, recorded lectures would be a better way for me. So this person wants the choice to be able to do that based on what's happening given their week. And for this person, it's actually a health issue. It's not, so we see already there's a range of different reasons why additional choices may actually build more agency with different groups of students.
So the next principle then is to provide options for representation. So this is the what of learning. This is your content and what you're teaching to students. And your goal here is to develop knowledgeable and resourceful students. So it's about what you present and how you present it to your students. Are you using one mode of presentation at the moment? If so, you have lots of options available to you. What assistance are you giving students to decode the language that you're using as well? So looking at the individual student, what they're bringing to the classroom. And our students are so diverse in terms of their educational backgrounds. We can't make assumptions in terms of their knowledge of, even if it's a cultural context. So always thinking about the language that we're using, any acronyms that we're using, anything like that, and how we can make sure that we're using plain English wherever possible, but also giving students the tools that they need and the skills that they need to decode that new and unfamiliar language that they're using. So in terms of the +1s that you can use then for representation. So think about the choice in how you present materials. So in an online context, I know somebody's asked there in terms of the UDL in an online context. So how are you presenting information? Is it all text? Is it all audio? Is it all video? Or do you have some options there? So ideally, you're giving students a choice. So you can listen to this podcast, you can read this journal article, you can look at this website, you can look at videos with captions. And I think captions are really important in terms of your content. If you're looking at videos, that you should have the options for students to have captions so that they can engage in the material. And there are lots and lots of reasons why a student might want to use captions, like why any of us would want to use captions. It's not necessarily students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Of course, captions are necessary, and students with that requirement should get captions, but there are lots of us who prefer to engage in the material using captions for lots of different reasons. Mind maps are also really useful in terms of how you're presenting content and encouraging students to create mind maps. So rather than just you present all the information, get students involved as content creators as well. And again, they can do that individually, as groups. There's lots of tools and software that you can use where students can collaborate on mind maps as they're creating them. So really just looking at the material and lifting it out of, that single flat way of presenting if you've got a single method of getting content across at the moment. So accessible documents are really, really important in terms of your content. And what we mean by accessible is that they're accessible by anybody who's using assistive technology, but also accessibility goes beyond that. So use your accessibility checkers. They're built into all of the Microsoft products and other products. Very, very easy to use. Not only will they flag any issues that you have, but they'll tell you exactly what to do to address the issue. Now, you can't rely solely on an accessibility checker, but an accessibility checker will get you 90% of the way there, making sure that your PowerPoints, your Word documents are accessible. So all of the research is showing that students want their classes recorded. So if you're doing live synchronous teaching, that you should also be recording and having that option for students, not just for students who can't attend. And sometimes that is the case, that they can go back and review, but also for other students to really facilitate their own pace of learning, that they can go back, they can review that material at their own pace. When it comes to a piece of assessment, they want to go back and check again. It really gives the students that variability, that flexibility, that they can actually engage in the material when they want to at the right time for them. Providing slides and materials in advance. So if you do have a live class that you're giving students the material in advance, they can look, they know what the objectives are for that class. They know if there's any pre-reading or pre-learning that you want them to do. And it really does facilitate any student who needs to use assistive technology to engage in the slides or other material. They can do that in advance if you provide the material. And doing all of these things means that a student doesn't have to, as Dara said, put up their hand and ask for something separate or something specific because they have a disability or they need a reasonable accommodation. But if you're putting all of this into place for students, it means that they are at the bottom of the UDL pyramid. They're engaged with everything and they're not having to get those separate accommodations. Look at your learning materials and see if you can make them a bit more creative. Use Immersive Reader, or encourage students to use Immersive Reader, which is a Microsoft product built in, super, super easy. They can listen to their texts. If you're using PowerPoint online, use captions, and there's even the option for the live translation as well in other languages. So another really good feature that students can engage with. Provide glossaries for students online, or encourage students to create their own glossary. So I've seen some really interesting examples where the first task, a student is set to create their own glossary from all the new terms that they're facing and all the new languages or terms that they're learning or things that they're decoding. And that's a good tool, a good skill for students to develop. Use your frequently asked questions as well. So anything you're getting loads of emails about, and anybody who teaches gets loads and loads of emails, and turn that into a frequently asked questions, point students towards that and then use that yourself as a resource next time you go to teach that module, and you'll know what those questions were and you can build them into the material. And finally, the last +1 is to make sure that you use authentic real-life learning examples. And that's, again, feedback from students if they can really connect with an educator who is very authentic and will use those a diversity of examples, and making sure that when you do give examples, you're not always focusing on the same kind of cultural context or the same group, that you actually have diversity built into that.
Yeah, so I suppose some of the quotes from the Learning from Home survey that I referenced previously that might kind of align with this. I'm focusing specifically on the piece around recording, because we're talking about blended and we're talking about what all that means and why students would want options to engage in person or online. So we have this first person here saying, I'd love we could have pre-recorded lectures with in-person Q&As with online options for this. I found it interesting that when I watch live lectures and then go back and watch them back, I realise I've missed tons at the live session. I really appreciated the Q&As, and these are the only parts that need to be live in this person's opinion. But it's really interesting that this person who's never had that option before, once they have had the option, they've realised how much they've been missing previously. So remember that recording isn't just about when people engage, it's also a really solid tool for study and review. And especially as we get automated captioning in, video becomes searchable, all those kinds of really cool stuff that we can do as a learner, especially if you have those good systems that support that. And then the second person, we see a very different viewpoint. Again, this is actually relating to the person's health. So you can see this person is pleading. They say, ensure all lectures are recorded. This, please. The amount of extra emotional and physical harm I've put myself through, forcing myself to get to class because I was already behind and the only person missing out was me. I don't want anyone else to be let down and not have the opportunity to study because of a health issue, keeping them from classes. It's not right. So this person has a condition that, you know, sometimes they'll wake up on one day and that condition just means that they're not well, you know, on some kind of semi-regular basis. So the fact that we haven't provided this learner is actually, we're actually asking them to do something that damages their health, just because we're not willing as an institution maybe to provide options for how people engage in our live in-person sessions.
Great. So the last principle we're going to talk about is providing options for action and expression. So this is the how of learning. This is what students do to demonstrate to you that they've met the learning outcomes. So it's students taking physical action, and we're developing strategic and goal-directed students. So some of the +1s you can do in terms of action and expression would be a lot around assessment, but think about the +1 here. So we're talking about something where you can start small. I like Celia has put a point in the chat there about she's found building a culture of trust and support is critical before UDL is rolled out. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think talking to students about universal design for learning can really help as well, especially in the action and expression principle. So modeling text-to-speech software. So again, showing students how to use different types of assistive technology that are useful for so many students. Including read aloud, facilitate recording. So as we've talked about, for review and vary the pace of learning for students. Look at skills development, and this one is really important. So when we try to introduce choice of assessment, diversity of assessment, variety of assessment, new assessment modes for students, it's really important that that's linked to skills development, so that we give the students the skills they need to, if we're going to say, okay, you can either do an essay or create a video, great. Well, then also you need to teach the students how to create a video. They need to have that skill, otherwise they're never going to take that choice. And we've seen loads of disappointed educators who offer choice and then don't see very many students taking that more kind of diverse choice. And that's because the students really didn't feel confident or didn't have the skills that they needed. And just like educators, students are extremely time poor, and they will stick with something that's more familiar to them, even if it will be, of course, to their benefit to create a video. So lots of learners will be able to demonstrate their learning more effectively through video or through a podcast or a more creative form of assessment. But students will stick to what they've done before. So it takes a lot of work. And I think that links back to Celia's point about creating that culture of trust and support, to encourage students to try these diverse methods. But if we work together across programs, across colleges, to introduce these methods early on to students, and it's not just an unusual module where you get to have this choice or diversity of assessment, it becomes part of the culture in your campus that students do have these options for action and expression, then that's really helpful as well. Something really simple that you can do is work with students on goal setting and monitoring their skills, and that links back to what you were doing in the first principle as well. So giving students templates for reflection, templates for goal setting, and working with them on that particular skill as well. So choice of assessment, as I said, absolutely brilliant. And Georgian O'Neill, my colleague here in UCD, has done huge amounts of work on choice of assessment. And we're doing a workshop actually on choice of assessment at the AHEAD conference in a couple of weeks. So if that's something you're particularly interested in, I'd encourage you to come along to that. But looking at the diverse assessment modes that you can use, and I suppose looking at what you have at the moment and how can you introduce one different method next time you run this module, next time it's assessed, and work with students on that as well. So do some focus groups with students, see how they engaged with the assessment type, see what they would like to see diversified in the module in terms of that assessment. Because students are expert learners, they're experts in their own assessment. They know the journey they take to complete a particular piece of assessment and what would or wouldn't be useful or beneficial for them. Diversity of assessment shouldn't mean over-assessment. So it shouldn't mean that now you've got, okay, so I'm going to introduce a podcast and I'm also going to do video, and then all of a sudden the students are extremely overwhelmed and they don't know what to do because they have all of these pieces of assessment. So look at that programmatic approach, but also talk to students. Make sure students know, so here's this piece of assessment you're doing in week 2. It's only worth 5%. You should only spend X number of hours on this piece of assessment, because we know lots of students, particularly when they start off in a program, will be kind of tendency towards perfectionism, and through being very nervous will spend lots and lots of time. So we need to be very explicit with students. They need to know exactly what's expected of them. So having your sample assessments and having your rubrics are really important for students as well. Opportunities for peer assessment, again, linking back into that engagement piece and having collaboration opportunities, and potentially using the e-portfolios as well for students to gather all of those pieces of work as they go through the semester.
I know we're pushing for time, so just quickly, on the action and expression piece, 2 more quotes. I can see the first person here is saying, one thing I'll miss from having things be online: no memory alone based exams. In my first year, I failed my psychology exams and scraped passes in my criminology ones. Now, second year, in both of my subjects for end of term assignments, I've been top 5 to 10 of my year. So I think there's a great point just in the chat there from Sue about assessment and ensuring that there's a clear link. But in my view, often actually it's about providing a choice within that. How do we meet the learning outcomes? Because you can see here that just in 1 year's change, the only thing that's changed is the assessment instrument, and this student's results have been transformed dramatically. So it tells us that there's a lot of things that we're doing as educators where we're actually massively disadvantaging some learners just by not offering different ways to demonstrate their learning. So this is about not lowering quality, but lowering the barriers. So it's almost like lowering the barriers to access the challenge, keeping the challenge high, but lowering the barriers to access it. And you can see here the second person says, the design of assessments, all written work. I'm so worried. I really wish I could have done more interactive assessments and this would have been taken into account. So this learner is feeling disadvantaged by that. So I know Lisa has to run at 12. So just in case, Lisa, you do end up having to jump off. Thanks so much for your contribution, as always, masterful. And I might hand over then to Helena. I might just kill the screen share momentarily because I don't think Helena's running off slides.
No, I'm not. I'm going rogue, as I always do. And yeah, just a little change up maybe from the slides. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I suppose. It was very interesting when I was told this was going to be about blended learning, because I think it's amazing the journey that we've been on the last 2 years, I suppose, since the pandemic came into our lives. And probably, I suppose, we have moved on maybe nearly 10, 20 years. We've moved on so quickly in 2 years, which is a wonderful thing. And it's never been a better time now to talk about blended learning or hybrid. And I suppose at Kinsale College, or as we're known now, we've a slight little change of name. We're Kinsale Campus under the Cork College of FET. We actually were a little bit more prepared than we thought for the pandemic, because back in September 2019, we actually became a digital hub. for Microsoft, and all the students and all the teachers got Office 365 accounts. And I suppose we were kind of looking at them for the first couple of months going, what do we do with this, and figuring it all out. And then, of course, a little thing called COVID came into our lives, and we went overnight. We had to go online, go remote. There was lockdown, as we know, and everything changed. Absolutely everything changed. We walk out of there on, was it March the 12th, I remember, on a Thursday. But the one thing was, we were very fortunate, because we had, I suppose, started this digital journey within the college, that we were actually able to hit the ground running the following Monday on Teams. So there was a bit of firefighting, as we all know, at the beginning, and it was kind of just get them over the line, you know, and just kind of, you know, get to the end of the academic year and see how we get on. But I suppose then we realised, coming back into September 2020, that we were going to have to, I suppose, really embed blended and hybrid learning into our teaching practices. We really had to sit down then and become quite reflective. And what are we actually going to do? And I suppose that was where UDL for us came into its own, because, as Dara said, it's non-prescriptive, which is the wonderful thing. So we were kind of going, right, okay, how do we change it up? So I'm just going to give you a small little example of what I did with my particular group of students, and kind of in a case study format. So I teach I'm the Learning Support and Disability Coordinator here in Kinsale campus, but I teach on the healthcare courses as well. And one of the modules that I teach on is the Disability Awareness module, which is in our level 6 health services program. And every year, without fail, I would take the students and we would do a walkability audit of Kinsale. So we would leave the college, they would get a little remit that they would have to do, they would walk around Kinsale, they would look at, you know, how inclusive it was, accessibility points, all that. We would meet afterwards for coffee, sit down and have a chat and talk about, I suppose, their findings. It was a lovely way at the beginning of the year for students, I suppose, to get to know each other, to form relationships, also have the little bit of learning, and who doesn't love a little walk around Kinsale on a fine sunny September day. Course then we went blended, and we were in lockdown and we actually couldn't implement that. So I was scratching my head going, how am I actually going to do this? Do I just throw it out and get rid of that idea completely, or what can I do? A little thing I discovered was Google Earth. And what we actually did was we used Google Earth to do the walkability audit in an actual digital format. So we went online on Google Earth onto Kinsale in our teams, went along the different streets on Google Earth, signposted, you know, different things. And it was absolutely fantastic. I was really blown away by the engagement of the students. I didn't think they would kind of, you know, embrace it, but they really did. And when I found out afterwards, they started going into Google Earth in their own towns. Some of them had never gone to Google Earth before. They started exploring different places. But what was really interesting when I looked for feedback from the students about this particular mode of assessment, because Dara and Lisa both mentioned this, it's about checking in with the students when you do anything new, or when you're about, you know, giving them choice. One of the things that I found with the students, especially those that would have, you know, learning needs, they were able to, you know, they might have social anxiety, especially students with AS, about going into a group setting and kind of socializing and doing this particular assessment. They found it actually more inclusive. They were able to partake in it from their own space. They were able to engage more by using the chat feature, going into kind of breakout rooms. It was really, really interesting. And it was something that I actually never thought of. So kind of what we've decided to do going forward is to do a more blended approach. So we're kind of keeping the walkability audit and going downtown, but actually one of the students this year, I was walking around with the phone, they were joining us in from Teams. So it's about, I suppose, when you look at it, it's more inclusion for all. And one of the other lovely things was when the students came back and I said to them, you know, present your findings now, and they kind of put what and collated everything they had and put it together. Then I suppose what they realized was they had just done their presentation as part of their leadership module, which, you know, they were kind of going, all right. So it's about integrating those learning outcomes for students, which is really, really important, because, you know, I suppose, and QQI loves their integration, and we like integration with LOs. And the other thing as well, I suppose, with doing just something very simple like that, it's about giving the students ownership, you know. So Lisa mentioned about, you know, an e-portfolio. We use Padlet now, so that the students can kind of take photos, they can put in little comments, they can build up a little portfolio of what they're learning on that, and they can just do it through their phone, you know. And I suppose but I suppose the other side of that is having access to digital. And it's like what Lisa said, you know, a lot of the students, we could presume that they might embrace this. You know, we also need to be careful of the fact that, I mean, some of our learners are not digital savvy, and having to put in the steps beforehand in relation to that. So I suppose one of the things that we're going to do going forward is build that into our induction week, is, I suppose, digital literacy, because if you are going to do blended learning approaches, that is something that I suppose we have to consider going forward. But that's just a little idea for you, one of the plus ones for UDL. And if anybody is interested, I suppose, in brainstorming or asking me more questions about UDL, I'll put my email address in the chat channel, and feel free anytime to contact me about it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Helena. That was wonderful, as always, a great example. So we might then just, I suppose, as a way of kind of wrapping up the session a little bit, and my colleague Tommy's going to come in shortly and show you some resources that if you want to explore your own kind of UDL journey a little bit more, where you can go. But I'd just like to ask you to engage in a bit of a takeaway reflection, and there's two ways you can respond. You can respond directly into the chat here. Indeed, in fact, let's make it three ways for the hell of it. If you wish, you can, if you would like to come on mic and actually discuss an idea that you've had today, please do put up your hand and you'll be welcome to come on mic. Yeah, you can put it directly into the chat if you prefer to keep that private, but if it's something you're on a Twitter user perhaps and you'd like to actually make that public, please feel free to use the hashtag #my+1promise and the hashtag UDL. Make sure both of those hashtags are in. If you'd like to include myself and Lisa, I'm at Dara Ryder and Lisa is at Lisa Padden, and just put in your one takeaway for today, one more way that you're going to commit to, having heard what you have today, to give your learners more ways to engage with your content, more ways to understand it, and more ways to express what they know and demonstrate their knowledge. So if you'd like to do that either in the chat, I can see Patricia's coming in there. Would you like to share this, Patricia? Thanks.
Hi, Dara. I have said that I would completely recommend if anyone's interested in UDL, just the AHEAD badge. It was brilliant. And I did the facilitator one, just excellent. I just did it recently, just last year, so it's just brilliant. But one thing I would say that, and my promise is to continue doing this, one small change. I made one small change to one of my assessments, and it made a huge difference to the learners. And I did speak to them about it and hear their feedback and choices and things like that. So it really, they taught me a lot. They taught me, I teach ESOL, and they taught me a huge amount. So my one small promise is to continue to do that. Keep making small changes along the way, because the small changes are making a huge difference. So that is definitely my one small promise. And that's one thing I would say, is to make small changes. They make a huge difference. And if you can continue integrating that along the way.
That's brilliant, Patricia. I swear Patricia's not a plant. We didn't we didn't ask her to come along.
No, I just can't praise it enough. It really did make a huge change to and I've been teaching ESOL for 7 years, and just that small change, it made it more realistic to them, and it made it just changing. It was just a fake map to real around Limerick City, and it made a huge change. So
That's fantastic. Thanks for that feedback. That's lovely, and a great idea for your +1. Just your +1 is to keep making +1s.
Keep making small changes. Keep
I
making
love it.
small changes. So
And we've
thanks
got
a
some
million.
great ones. Thanks a million,
Thank
Patricia.
you.
I know you have to run, so thanks for your time today.
Bye.
And just I see some great ones coming in. Helena, you might even react with me here if you'd like to. So I can see Amy's saying her +1 is to ask your members, students, service users what they need and show evidence that you've listened and changed something as a result. That's massive.
I absolutely. I've always championed this, and we think he mentioned it as well about telling the students about UDL. I've always said this from the beginning, but getting feedback from them, I think, is really important, because that you can see what works and what doesn't work, and you have to be open to change as well and open to making mistakes. And what will work for one learner may not work for another learner. So yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. I can see there's a few more here in the chat. Rosalind is saying my +1 is to use plain English forms, instructions and templates. That's a fantastic way to lower barriers. And as I said, this is what UDL is all about, is lowering barriers to access the challenge, not reducing the challenge, because challenge is really important for learning. If we want to develop as individuals, we have to be challenged. But actually, are we as educators putting up unintended barriers to the challenge itself? So you can see Anne here has asked for a change around the continuation of remote learning for learners who need it. So look, Anne's looking at it from a kind of policy perspective here. She's suggesting maybe we should be challenging some of the sort of the return to normal cultural thing that's going on at the moment as we go back, and we're maybe forgetting a lot of the good things that we learned. And it's important to say that face-to-face is so important, that when we did that learning from home research, so many students with disabilities, it might be a cohort that you would expect to have more of a tendency to lean towards online learning. Still, the majority of them did favour face-to-face, but there was a really, really significant minority, about 1/3, who actually felt that online learning was something that was reducing barriers for them. I can see here that Nicole is sharing her +1 is to review content for plain language. Again, she's mentioned that piece around language potentially being a barrier.
I see actually Celia here has a nice one. My +1 is record short videos on how to write their individual assignments each time. Yeah, I think that's wonderful, and I've actually done that myself, and it makes a huge difference for students, because they can watch it back then afterwards outside of class time, and they can then ask you questions around it. I think, Celia, that's really good.
And I love Melanie's one here. It's fantastic. A +1 brain break. Her +1 is a brain break in classical lectures to re-engage the students. It's really important sometimes that we give students time to internalize what we're teaching. And I know this session has been very fast today and probably not a great example of that, but I think that's really important. And actually telling students, being explicit about that, we're actually going to take a brain break now, and we're going to take some time to think about the concepts. And maybe when you come back from that, I'm going to ask you X, Y, or Z, or we're going to talk in a group about X, Y, or Z. I think that's a really, really brilliant one. So I might just try on to Tommy. What I'm going to do is in the background, I'm going to check the hashtag just to see if anybody's come in, and I might come back in after Tommy's had a chance to share some of the resources that, if you're interested in finding out more, you can explore. Are you there, Tommy?
Great, thanks, Dara.
Perfect.
Can you hear me, see me?
Yep.
Hello, everyone. That was a really interesting presentation, thought-provoking. Thanks, Dara. Thanks, Lisa. And thanks, Laura. Some really, really interesting stuff on UDL. And I was just going to show you, I'm very conscious of time. We're slightly gone over, so apologies. This will be quick. Just some signposts to encourage everybody to please explore a bit more, as Dara mentioned too, was the University for All Hub, the UDL FET resource hub that Dara spoke about earlier, and the practitioner's guide as well. And then our own, in collaboration with UCD, that Lisa referred to, was the UDL digital badge. And it was encouraging to hear people were on the audience here have completed that. Well done on that. We had over 770 participants this year got through, so it was a great figure, really was. And then also we have our own AT guru, Trevor, who could be in the audience as well with us. And he's a brilliant sort of discovery AT tool hive there on our website, on the AHEAD website, is well worth looking at. And both Lisa and Trevor will be presenting at our conference which I'll just briefly speak about now and give you some highlights.
Sure, and just to point out as well that the UDL badge will be running again in October to December, the national rollout of that badge, and it is free for all educators. So if you're interested, pop onto the AHEAD website and sign up to the mailing list, you get more. And just to say as well that there's a ton more practical examples on the UDL for FET resource hub within the guidance itself, but also there's video examples. I think Helena is actually one of them as well, if you want to kind of see what other people are doing in terms of UDL implementation as well.
Thanks, Sarah. As we mentioned earlier, and I saw, Laura, you popped in your conference, so we won't hog the limelight too much with the QQI one. I've just thrown in the link for our own conference coming up, which is online, and we have a nautical team, and I'll just briefly go through it there with you because I am conscious of time, guys. So it's Safe Haven, a Stormy Port, exploring how tertiary education design impacts our health. So it's virtual, and it starts on Monday the 21st, and it runs for the week until Friday the 25th. Really exciting lineup. We've got some great speakers coming from the US as well, be it virtually. And we're kicking off with a time frame from 12 noon till 5 o'clock. And it's broken down into a series of workshops. And we've got some very exciting lightning talks this year, which are quick fire, rapid presentations on different projects, which would involve 6 slides and 6 questions as well. So that should be really interesting. And it's followed by keynote speakers as well. And I'll just go briefly through the highlights of the main themes of the day. So day 1 is Monday, the role of digital and physical accessibility. And we've got Alistair McNaught coming from the UK, who's doing a lot of recent collaborative work with AHEAD. And we'll be also launching at the conference some short accessible videos for continuous professional development, which will be launched at the conference. We'll speak about more of that in the conference itself. But he's going a workshop on writing alt text, alternative text, and the importance of it in best practice. Day 2 is Tuesday, Agile Student Support. And again, a collaborative approach. We have Disability Student Trinity Support Services Director Declan Traynor and Courtney McGrath, who will be talking about student partnership and the whole Trinity Ability Co-op, and a collaborative initiative between students and stakeholders and staff in Trinity, which is really exciting because the whole collaborative team, Lisa alluded to earlier, is so important in the whole field of UDL. Wednesday, day 3 is International Mobility and Workplace Learning and Social Engagement. And we have, again, a collaboration with Vivian Rath, who works with AHEAD as well and is a lecturer in Trinity College, and Barbara Waters, freelance consultant from the UK, who's worked a lot with us recently as well. And Barbara's also the editor of the AHEAD Journal, which I would encourage you to look at the website as well. We're looking for submissions up until the 6th of April for our AHEAD Journal, so all welcome. Day 4, Thursday, is Innovative Student Centered Based Design and Assessment. We have an exciting speaker coming from the US, Jess Stummel. People might have heard of him, Jesse Stummel, University of Denver. And this will be a controversial topic because it's on the whole sort of theory and ethos and the move towards ungrading. So that should be a really interesting discussion point. And the last day, we have another US speaker, and that's Dr. Brian Beattie, who's going to speak on the whole move of HyFlex and blended learning and hybrid learning, which we're all sort of attuned to and moving towards, and where the future is going with that. So that should be a really interesting day. And I should say at the end of each day, we also have what's called a water cooler or debriefing session, where it gives people an opportunity to ask questions, explore the topics of the day, particularly the keynotes, and sort of plan where we're going in the future field of education and disabilities on that. So it's very exciting. I'd encourage you to sign up, guys, and Dara might come in and say something else.
Thanks, man. No, that's perfect. That's great. I'm particularly interested in myself in hearing from Jesse and the concepts of ungrading and how we can maybe think about placing less emphasis on grades in our system and more emphasis on learning and development. And so I think that's going to be a very interesting one. He has quite a well-established methodology now for doing this and maintaining rigor within that concept. So yeah, I'll hand over, I suppose, back over to Laura, and I just say myself and Tommy have a meeting with the HEA in 2 minutes, so we will have to scarp her, so apologies if we drop out, but thanks so much, Laura, for having us, and thanks so much to everybody, and especially Helena and Lisa for joining us, but everybody in the room for such an engaged audience. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks very much, Dara, and please pass on our thanks to Lisa as well, and to Helena and Tommy. It was really informative, and I think those kind of practical examples about the +1 were really useful. And talking about partnership with students and feedback loop and collaboration. They were all areas we're very much behind, and kind of looking at the work that NSTEP is doing in those kind of areas as well. So just big thank you to all our presenters. I know people have to run. So thank you to everyone who took the time to attend, and thanks for all the activity in the chat. That was brilliant. So take care, everybody, and keep an eye on our events page, and we'll post any upcoming events that'll be of interest there. And don't forget the AHEAD conference too, of course. Thank you, everybody, and thanks
all. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was a great session. Thank you.